Hello again. On Tuesday, I officiated at the funeral of a man whose mother we had buried last week. After the service in church, I ended up at the graveside on my own for a few moments before the family arrived. It feels strange enough being in the church building at the moment, as all the churches I work with have closed their buildings for public worship. But funerals are an understandable exception. We can't quite fit the current legal maximum of 30 mourners in that particular building while keeping distancing in place, but we weren't far off. But even though I know we have decent COVID security in place in the church building, being outdoors in the cemetery later still felt safer. And so I stood by this man's grave, next to his mother's grave, waiting for the family, with ice and snow still on the ground and thick cloud in the sky. There was a breeze, there was drizzle in the air, and the kites were circling round with their distinctive calls, sometimes heading across into the high trees near the river. It felt wonderfully bleak, and I felt something of the responsibility and the privilege I had in that moment, a milestone on the way in the life of that particular family, a milestone which of course none of them wanted. And I was aware of God in that moment. And then in the evening we watched some television. We've been taking advantage of the BBC putting a few old series on the iPlayer to introduce the lad to Blackadder. And on Tuesday evening we got to the final episode of Series 4 with its now famous ending of the First World War soldiers going over the top together. A remarkably poignant ending for a comedy series, and I found I must have got something in my eye. Later in the evening, my wife and I started watching Russell T Davies's new series, It's a Sin, which is set during the beginnings of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. And then we watched the news. 100,000. In a day which for me had already been quite full of death and the emotion which surrounds it, both real and fictional. There it was. In the UK, we have passed 100,000 COVID deaths. On average, before this Thursday Thought you're listening to now, these recordings have been 8 minutes and 24 seconds long. 100,000 of them playing continuously would last about a year and 7 months. I led a single funeral on Tuesday. At the rate of one funeral a day, it would take more than 270 years to get through 100,000. If I'd started taking funerals when I became an adult, which of course I didn't, it happened a lot later than that. If I'd started taking funerals when I became an adult, I'd have had to have taken 8 or 9 a day to make it to 100,000 by now. 100,000 bodies would probably stretch from Oxford to Sheffield. 100,000 is probably 2/3 of the entire population of Oxford. 100,000 is a lot of deaths. And each one of them brings the tears and the grief I witnessed the other day. Each one of them is someone who meant the world. Of course, it's part of my role as a minister to have days like that. And as I say, it is both a responsibility and a privilege. But it's hard to get hold of what 100,000 deaths means. You may remember early in the pandemic, government advisers said we'd be doing well to restrict the death toll to 20,000. 5 times that is, by any measure, not doing well. So where do we go from here? Well, maybe we shouldn't hurry too much to go anywhere in terms of our emotions, our feelings. Grief is horrible, but it's a witness to love. I wouldn't wish the sadness on anybody, but really there should be tears at a funeral. That is an appropriate time for them. Keep calm and carry on is okay as far as it goes, but lamenting does not always mean keeping calm. And anger at injustice does not always mean keeping calm. At a funeral, we mark the moment as part of the moving from one way of living to another. We mark the moment as part of the moving from one way of living to another. Once the family had left the graveside, I walked out of the cemetery with the kites and the ice, which felt in the middle of nowhere. Back up the lane, past the edge of town factory and some houses, and before I knew it, I was back on the main road. Not quite as busy as usual, of course, but still with people around who would have known nothing of that poignant and bleak scene just a few minutes away. There is lamenting to be done, and there is anger to be held. Let's not hide from either of those things. But one day we will walk back from the bleak graveside to where there is life. God bless. See you soon.